Hello, everyone. Welcome to our special series, Special Spirit series. I'm so sorry. Rushing to introduce our special guest today, Dr. Roseann Hodge. Roseann is joining us today. She's a integrative and pediatric mental health expert and a founder of the Global Institute of Children Mental Health. Just a few of the things Roseann seems to be doing, but I will let Roseann introduce herself in her own words. And we will be talking about children's mental health and variety of issues around it. So I'm super excited. I did mention to Roseann, my son has been diagnosed on the autism spectrum. So I've got even more desire to learn more about the techniques and modalities Roseann is using in her work, working with children. But Roseann, please introduce yourself in your own words to our viewers.
Well, thanks for starting this conversation. I obviously am super passionate about children's mental health, both as a professional and a mom of two kids with special needs. So, I'm a woman on a mission to change the way we view and treat children's mental health on a global level, which is why I started the Global Institute of Children's Mental Health and why I get out there so much and talk because I want to give parents a message of hope. And I also want to give parents actionable tips to help reduce and reverse their child's mental health naturally, because there are many evidence-based treatments that help to address mental health symptoms. And that's what I've been doing for 30 years. And I've helped thousands of children and their families reduce and reverse mental health, using diet, nutrition, stress-based management techniques, neurofeedback, biofeedback, psychotherapy, and, really, truly only using holistic therapies that are proven scientifically. So I've been very grateful in these 3 decades to be part of children's healing journey.
That's amazing. And you mentioned you have own children who are children diagnosed with special needs.
Yeah.
Has it really been a trigger for developing new ways to treat and view mental health?
Yeah. I mean, I've been working for 30 years in 2021 in mental health in some capacity, everything from working in psychiatric hospitals to working with drug addicts and working in schools, private practice, all different kinds of capacities. And so long before I had my own kids, I was helping special needs kids. But when you have your own child, it is a different story. You know what I mean?
Oh, yes.
Nobody can understand the pain that you experience and the worry like another parent, especially a mom, when your kid isn't in the box. You know what I mean? And not that we want our kids to be in the box, but when it's taken outside of your control and your kid is different, right? And we certainly learn to celebrate those exceptionalities, but the road can be very hard. And in so many ways, from finding treatment to friendships with your kids, to friendships with other families. I mean, and just the constant worry about, what happens to your kid today, what happens to them tomorrow, and then what happens to them in the distant future is something that's always on our minds, right?
Yes. Yes, it's the unknown of that journey for our children, which I feel causes a lot of stress and anxiety within the parents as well, and not only children. Of course, children have their own anxieties.
Yeah. Oh no, I think we're way more spinny about it and worried than our kids are. You know what I mean? I think developmentally they get to points that cause them stress, but we worry so much about it, and I don't think it's just hard to put into words that kind of worry and how isolating it can be. So like, for you to create a tribe for people to be able to talk about it honestly is an amazing thing. Because I think out of everything, like the terrible treatments that you get and all that, which stink on a lot of levels because it kind of reduces your hope and certainly is costly. I think the camaraderie and support is an amazing thing when you can really find people who share the same journey.
Yes, we were talking before. I said I mentioned to Roseann that I'm part of a support group of moms with children with on autism spectrum, ADHD, with different disabilities as they are classified. And for me, it was the one of the best things which happened on my journey to healing and sort of normalizing the experience around my son, and a very challenging process of assessing his developments, and then finally going through the assessment, we achieved the diagnosis, and it was that diagnosis, which was to me partially a relief and partially a disaster as well. Relief because I could put a label on something which wasn't quite right, but then of course hearing that the word that your child is disabled for life, as medical industry calls it, it is quite a shock, quite a weight to take. But saying that, it's still a beautiful journey of parenthood, and having those beautiful moments of celebrating differences rather than focusing on sort of being upset or about it. But what it was really, really interesting to me is how differently do you look and view and treat the children with variety of disabilities here and mental health problems compared to the standard medical field.
Yeah. So, for all these decades, I've always done things differently. I thought things would be different in the world of mental health, but right now, they're not. So I do treat things and actually diagnose things very differently. So first of all, I actually check under the hood is what I like to call it. So I use real data to look at what could be there, because the standard of care in the world for mental health is guessing, right? So they come in with symptoms and it's like, sounds like it's this. So that's probably what you have. And then part B is typically offering a medication, which, 20 years ago, that wasn't what happened. Part B was typically therapy or education or a support group or something. And then maybe if those things failed down the road, they would consider a medication. Now we put medication first without efficacy. There's not a lot of research to substantiate, particularly psychiatric medications for children are often used off-label, meaning that there's no research to substantiate how they work for kids and how they benefit them. So
that's quite worrying, isn't it?
It's very worrying. And even when you look at the research, particularly for SSRIs for adults, right? So anti-anxiety medications in particular, that research is carefully crafted. The initial research studies were 8 weeks, and if you look in your pamphlet, it's only showing you the 4 weeks of the research study, because at the 8-week mark, it showed that the medication wasn't working. But at the 4-week, it looked pretty good. So that's pretty common knowledge, and you can just Google and find that. There's a great documentary called Medicating Normal that talks about it. But what do I do that's different? So first of all, I typically do either, if you're in person with me, a QEEG brain map. I'll explain what that is. If you're remote and you're doing neurofeedback with me, I do what's called a brain check, where I statistically look at averages of different brain waves. So a QEEG is a way to get a visual representation of actually how the brain is functioning in the regions, over certain regions. So your frontal lobes or your emotional centers, or the different regions, you can see them. And then you can see what's called site-to-site communication, which tells us how the brain is talking to itself, which is very, very important in processing and learning, which so many of our special needs kids struggle with. As well as attention, right? And so those become barriers for them learning. And many of our special needs kids need a higher level of repetition in order to learn, right? And so we need to understand how they best process. So when somebody comes to me, I do a QEEG brain map or brain check, and then a deep clinical intake, right? So that clinical intake is important, and we don't want to not know what's going on in somebody's history. Was there a birth trauma? So many of our kids have birth traumas. Does that affect your brain functioning? Yes. And it really gives me that clear diagnostic picture. And once you really understand, even if it's not a diagnosis, like you said, your son sort of fits into the autism box, but sort of doesn't. And I hear that so much. But at least you know what the symptoms are, and you can address things at a symptom level. Diagnoses do help us. Sometimes you don't need them. And I don't think you should wait for a diagnosis before you get treatment. But I do often find that many people have the wrong diagnosis. So, for example, it's very common for somebody to come to me and say, my kid has ADHD, and they don't. What they have is a learning disability, or more commonly, anxiety. And and so it's super easy with a brain map, a QEEG brain map, to say, this is really what it is. There's no guessing about what it is, which is what I love, because again, in mental health, we're doing educated guessing depending on the experience of that person. And for example, autism, right? So I'm a certified school psychologist, did psychoed neuropsych testing for 20 something years. And people were terrible at assessing autism. I mean, terrible, like cringeworthy. And towards the end of the time that I was assessing people, I was that lady you would call when you had a lawyer. And, I had a lot of cases, those kind of cases, which were great, because I was always able to be of help every single time to make a difference, like a dramatic difference financially for these kids. But it was sad what you saw, right? So, like a great example of a terrible, terrible situation that was such a straightforward case of autism was, I had a girl that I was working with that was so clearly on the autistic spectrum that it was shocking that the school district didn't want to acknowledge. And the school district actually was forced to hire me to evaluate this girl. And anyway, the long and short of it is, it's very, very it's based on that experience and observation, right? And if people don't know what they're seeing, they can't really distinguish. So she was diagnosed with ADHD, but she had every autistic sign, like couldn't engage, right? She tried to engage, but she couldn't maintain any type of reciprocal interaction. I had observed her in a recess in 25 minutes. 14 attempts to try to engage with the other kids. Now, the person I was with said to me, don't you think she was playing beautifully? And I said, she wasn't playing. She tried to interact 14 times. So this is an example of how bad there are people in charge. This was a special ed supervisor, right? This is a supervisor of who gives services to this kid who couldn't do it. So myself and a neurologist said she was on the autistic spectrum, and the school district said no. Anyway, they said yes because I was there, and I had to twist their arms and how to play the game and whatnot. But this is what happens. This is very common, and I'm sure people who are listening are saying, that's sort of my story that people don't always believe me, right?
Oh gosh, I've heard so many stories when there was a real fight to get the diagnosis, and it's almost against you as a parent. It's against your instinct to fight for your child to be actually diagnosed, and we know why, because obviously that because of that we can put that label, whatever it is, and make sure that our child gets an extra support. And
and it's not fun to fight. It's not fun. It's not anything I like to do. I had to prepare them, and the parents literally were shaking after the meeting. I of course got the kid what they needed, but honestly, if I wasn't there, it would have never happened, because nobody would have had the guts to fight. I mean, I could tell you really what went down. Like, I literally hijacked the room and told people they couldn't walk out until they answered my questions and stuff like that. Who's going to do that? I did it. Because it was, and this was black and white. This wasn't, there are a lot of cases I'm doing that are gray, but this was such a black and white. It was like, oh, textbook. So it was, and why? In this situation, it becomes people take things personally and they decide this is what I see. So, which is really a shame. And it's a dramatic example of what happens all the time. But, you have to take an analytical approach, right? So if your child's being diagnosed, autism requires some level of one-to-one testing. You have to see how they do on a reciprocal relationship. I think that becomes really difficult. So many parents will say, but they're interested in other kids. Many kids on the spectrum are interested in other kids, particularly the kids that are with a higher intellect. They just don't know how to do it. And so that becomes like an aha moment for parents, And yes, the majority of kids on the autistic spectrum are what we call mid-functioning. So they have not a high intellect, but they are on the lower side, at least the lower side of average, but even below that, borderline. And so their intelligence, there is a barrier, right, in their learning and their processing, and that learning interferes not just with academics, but socially too. So it's just the kids with higher intellect often can repeat information. And so they can look much more functional and capable than they are.
Which itself presents a different level of challenges, because it could be easily masked as there is nothing wrong, but still anxiety will be there. And I think that's what, I don't know. I mean, this will be a question actually. So how do we recognize what are the signs of anxiety versus stress? I mean, we all get anxious, we all get stressed, but there is that specific anxiety, which is so significant for those kids.
And stress and anxiety in general are at a higher rate with kids with learning challenges because of their learning challenges. So, stress is a normal response to a stressor, right? So you got a bad grade, and so you're upset. Okay. And so your nervous system says, okay, this is something you should be upset. You go from, in terms of how your body handles stress, your autonomic nervous system handles stress. And so there's a parasympathetic, which is relaxed, and then a sympathetic, which is I'm getting ready for a war, right? So your nervous system goes into the stress state. Then it's like, okay, I can study, I can do better. And then it goes back into more normal, right? And so when we are constantly stressed, which happens so many times to us as parents with kids with special needs, but also to kids with learning challenges, what happens is your nervous system starts to be in a constant stress mode, right? So, and what do you see with kids with stress, right? So some of it is an overlap with anxiety in what you see, but anxiety becomes a clinical issue when you are experiencing it for several months. They say 6 months, but a long time. and it's interfering with something in your life. So for a child, it's interfering with relationships at home, at school, your learning. It's got to be doing something. An adult, it's interfering with your work as well as your relationships. And you, that there's some type of function is impaired in some way, right? And it's unique to everybody. But you often see with kids with both stress and anxiety physical signs. So you might see headaches. Stomach aches are a classic sign for kids with anxiety or high stress. Sleep problems. You might see increased irritability beyond for something you would expect in that age range. So teenagers are going to be more cranky. But this would be like, wow, they're literally cranky 24 hours a day. You don't even get a glimpse of something pleasant. And so, and often too, when it really flips to anxiety, for those of us that try to do stress relieving things a little bit every day with our kids, you're noticing it's just not tamping it down. So you're doing good stuff because many people do good stuff, particularly during this pandemic. I think people are like, man, the world is stressful. Better find a good routine.
Yes, and routine is the key word as well with many children on the spectrum and with special needs. I guess it's
good for all kids. Routine is good for all kids. You don't have to, and as adults. You know what I mean? Like to have some type of routine and also to really prioritize, health and wellness, is so important. And it doesn't have to be a lot. It could be like 10 minutes a day. It's great when you can take, like, I went in the sauna last night for like an hour. My husband came down and was like, I was worried you passed out in there because you're never in there that long. You're in there like 20 minutes. And it doesn't have to be an hour. It could be 10 minutes is what I'm saying.
Yeah. It's just
nice to be in there an hour. Yeah. Take the time and role model it for your kids and ideally do it with your kids, I think that's really helpful.
Yes. And going back to what we can do with our kids, your methods are different. I mean, your diagnoses are different, much more thorough. Your methods of healing, treating your children, patients are different, and you are talking about holistic methods. So would you be able to, and even talking about reversing the symptoms of autism and ADHD? I bet all the parents are as curious as I am now at this moment. How to do it? What? So I mean, I know there are secrets of the trade, but
no. I mean, these are all really. First of all, everything I do involves, has a neuroscience and research behind it. So every treatment I pick, is evidence-based. And that's the thing that I think is really surprising for people that, there's lots of research out there for a variety of things for mental health that can make little changes and dramatic changes. I think the key is sticking with it. I think one of the greatest challenges I face with a family is everyone thinks everything should be 60 seconds. And here in America, people are very impatient. And we all think that there's a pill to fix it. So in America, 1 in 6 people are on a psychiatric medication. 1 in 6. So
pretty in a family, pretty much.
So if it's not in your cluster of family of 4 or 5, it's going to be in the next, it's going to be there. So, and why is that? There's a lot of reasons why that is, but that's what we're being told and being pushed and marketed. But also people have an expectation that you just get to feel better. And also people don't want to feel uncomfortable. People don't want to feel sad, right? I recently had something sad happen to me and I've been grieving for like 2 weeks and taking the time, and it's not really convenient. but I got to do it. And it's just what it is. Right. And so, and you have to give that time to the process so you can heal and move on from it. Because when we shove things down with medication, we don't do it. So what's my secret juju? So for 30 years, I've been only using holistic treatments. In the beginning, I used to recommend medications because that was, again, when you tried things and it didn't work, that's what you did, right? Mm-hmm. Now it becomes the first thing, right? And what was happening back then, and now it's always happening, is the kids, I would say, listen, there's no other choice. Like, you've tried X, Y, and Z, and we're not getting you far enough. Try some meds. Every single time somebody would have a serious adverse reaction. It wasn't even like little reactions. It was like bad stuff. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so I was like, there's got to be another way, which led me to neurofeedback. But the basis of my work is focusing on 8 pillars. And I've taken this work, and it's in my book that comes out April 27th. It's going to be okay. And amazing. And it's fun. Mm-hmm. And then I have a program called Get Unstuck, and we have a wait list for that. And that's where I personally work with people virtually in a small group, and I teach them how to go through it. So, the 8 pillars are essentially 6 of the pillars are the same for if you have diabetes, you have anxiety, you have autism. But with kids, there's a couple other pillars that are different. So, what are they? They're nutrition. They're nutritional deficiencies. They're stress management. They're using brain-based therapies. They're sleep. They're detoxification. And what's different about what I do is the parenting component and the brain-based. So I have spent this 30 years testing out and using different brain-based therapies like breath work, meditation, right? And these are things parents can do on their own, right? Yes. Got to do it, and you got to do it every day, people. I don't want to hear you doing it once a week, okay? So, it's like you're not going to build a muscle if you're going to the gym once a week. If you do it a little bit every day, you're going to look pretty damn good. And it's the same thing. And that's what I think the message that is missing for parents, because they want to do it. If somebody told me my child has had Lyme disease and PANS and PANDAS for 14 years, he got it at 22 months. And I have learned so much in that damn process. And nobody told me in the beginning to prepare for a marathon. So everything was a sprint. Yeah. So the first 7 or 8 years was a sprint. Oh, this treatment's going to be it. And then it wasn't. And then there's and then once I shifted that mindset of like, oh, each one is going to do a little something. Then I was like, oh, okay. And then it started to preserve my mental health. Right. And as captain of the ship, we often think our self-care is the last thing that's important, because trust me, in those first 7 or 8 years, it was.
Yes. I know completely what you are saying. Yes.
Right, Monica. I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, here's Andrea saying she creates a vision. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So, when I work with parents, that's one of the first things I do. Like, what's your vision? Nobody says like, go to Yale. Like, they say, I want my kid to be happy and healthy, but those aren't always the things that they focus on. They focus on, oh, he's got to have this grade. He's got to have this. He's got to have that. And then their expectations don't match up to the growth and the healing that their child makes. So it's really understanding what is, what your child can do, and also not letting people limit you, right? I recently worked with somebody with a genetic disorder and very, very young child. And the medical person said, oh, well, you can expect your child's not going to go to college, and they're not going to do this, and they're not going to do that. And she was like, what the heck are you talking about? My kid's got a totally normal IQ and no behavioral issues, but he has this. Why are you telling me he's not going to do this? So she was so traumatized by it that she almost became immobilized. And then she found me, and then I was like, okay, we can do this and we can do that. And I was like, this is amazing. He's only 3. We can do this. There's so much you can do in the brain when a child is very young. I mean, you could do something with an 80-year-old, don't get me wrong. But neurologically, with the plasticity and the flexibility of the brain of a kid under age 8, it's unbelievable. It's such a travesty we don't diagnose earlier. So the platform for healing is to make lifestyle changes in these areas. And, there's a lot you can do, right? And it's what works for you. What are the needs of your child? And understanding, even understanding genetic mutations can be a game changer in mental health. I mean, we don't talk enough about these kind of things. People are very afraid of supplements. They're afraid of dietary changes, and they need guidance.
Yes.
So, and what works for one person is different for another, but yet there are foundational pieces that are critical, right? Your kid's not sleeping, guess what? Their mental health and behavior are not going to be what they should be. Just like if we don't sleep, right?
Well, as we're talking of sleeping, my son has been has had many challenges and still has about in the sleeping department, and it's a common knowledge when we don't sleep well, we are cranky, and we obviously don't develop as well as children without that sleep, enough of hours of sleep. So it was, for me personally, it was a constant challenge of sort of working on the issue of sleeping, and then not sort of worrying about the signs of irritation and frustration during the day, because they were the direct result of
not sleeping.
Sleep, absolutely.
Yeah. You had to say this is from sleep. It's not because he has a secondary mood disorder or something else, right? Because when your kid starts acting in having struggling behaviorally, and you're unsure, we often put people in a mental health category when it can be really from physical problems. And I think that's one of the greatest things that, the research says 60 to 70% of all mental health problems are related to a physical source.
So that's amazing. That's 3/4 of all the mental health issues.
So sometimes there's a pre-existing problem that's exacerbated. Sometimes there's issues that are completely created. Like, for example, I do a lot of stuff with infectious disease. And when it comes to infectious disease, particularly tick-borne illness, which is all over the world, right? Only Antarctica doesn't have ticks. And so there's a lot of misinformation, and about 35 to 40%. The research says about 35% of children with autism also have PANS and PANDAS, which means that there's typically an infectious disease source that causes psychiatric. So if we're treating somebody for anxiety, or more commonly for me, OCD, and we're treating them for OCD, we're using medication, which the medication for OCD, the research says it's not terribly efficacious. There's a type of psychotherapy that's better. But the source is strep or Babesia, a type of tick-borne infection. What are we doing? We're giving them a psych med when their problem is an infectious source.
Yes.
And this is my life. This is what happens to all these people that come to me. So we have to get better at testing. So somebody asked, do I test for allergies and food intolerance?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Juliet is asking about food allergies.
Yeah. Yes. So I work with a provider team of providers who do the deeper testing. So yes, but not everybody. Some people want to do the deep testing. I personally have done, allergy testing on myself for 20 something years. It's so fascinating to see what you have intolerances to. Have you ever done that work, Monica, for your son?
No, see, while you are talking about it, my next question is, how do you do it with small children? My son is 6.
Yeah.
I tried to test him, but there was a blood, obviously, sample required for that. And
there are urine. There are testing that does urine.
Okay.
So there are different ways to test. And if you really, when my kids were really, really young, we would do kinesthetic muscle testing. And so you have to be comfortable with that. I'm totally comfortable with it. I could tell you some stories that are like, what?
No, I'm keen of that method myself.
Yeah. Yes. So, kinesthetic muscle testing is you put a source. Here's my lemon. I have my lemon oil. You tighten up and you see, is your arm strong? That means you don't have a sensitivity. If the substance it creates a weakness, then you have some type of intolerance or an issue with it. And I'm going to tell you, like, I can't believe how spot on it was when my kids were really little. And my older son, it was always dairy. And then we did testing. He had full on allergy to dairy. It wasn't even an intolerance. He was like allergic. And I always just thought,
the thing which he desired most.
Yeah, he desired a lot of cheese, but my kids are great. I mean, in the throes of his infectious disease, he was temporarily a terrible eater, but I have to say my kids are ridiculously amazing eaters, and particularly my younger kid is a 99.999.
Oh, that's lucky.
Well, they didn't have access. They didn't have access to crap. So it was like, you either eat this or you don't eat. So, and I'm going to say my kid doesn't have, my kids at different times did have sensory issues. So I don't want to say that, but I don't have a child on spectrum, and there's all kinds of things. And yes, we had to do sensory stimulation sometimes before we ate and whatnot. But I do have to say, I use this as my benchmark. I have a mom that I work with, 3 kids on the autistic spectrum of different levels. And she got her kids off of all the junk, gluten and dairy and everything. And I think if that woman could do it, anybody could do it. So, and
that's appreciation of how important the nourishment.
Yeah. And it was hard. It was like so hard for her. So I think it's just different. My kids never had exposure. My younger one has never had wheat. So it's just different. Their mouth doesn't, for those of us, I don't have wheat, you don't experience, your taste buds are different. It's just very different. So everyone's got to do what they've got to do. No guilt, no shame, but slight tweaks. Even if you can increase, 2 or 3 different foods that are nutrient dense, will actually make a difference in your child's behavior in their brain. So,
and supplements. Are you a fan of supplements?
I'm a huge fan of supplements, and especially because our children have genetic mutations. So I have genetic mutations. My kids have genetic mutations. They're very common. So what are these mutations? The most common is something called MTHFR. Look it up. And it is, I think I've only had one child on the autism spectrum who didn't have it. And it's you in particular, you lack an enzyme to properly utilize the B vitamins. And so there are 9 B vitamins. They are essential vitamins for our nervous system to work properly. And without them, your nervous system can't work properly. So,
yes.
So, and yes, you can get tested. There's testing for it, genetic testing, and then you check your B levels and whatnot. I definitely have all this stuff detailed in my book when it comes out, and the research behind it, because, and you can Google this stuff and you can find it. I really wanted this to be a resource where somebody could do one thing and be like, here, okay. Again, I've had to learn this stuff over 30 years. And, but there's so many things. What I always try to tell parents is like, there are things that can create big changes. Like I do neurofeedback, people have dramatic changes. Okay. But there's a lot of things that people can do on the daily at home, controlling it themselves, and it can start creating change. You've got to stick with it and you've got to do it. So like if your kid is gluten sensitive, parents will say, well, I give them a little. No, it doesn't work like that. Okay. You can't have it. End of story. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to hear about the crying because I do it. And there's so many alternatives. Like when I was doing this 20 years ago, oh God, you couldn't go to a restaurant. Now there's just they've made it so easy, tasty. You know, if you're not a cook, there's lots of products available. And, you know, there are challenges, and we're already challenged as special needs parents. We are already overworking. We are already doing things. What I challenge people to do is to say, shift your efforts. Shift your efforts to things that actually create change, because what you're doing is swimming upstream and it's not working, you know? Yeah. And so, yes, I understand this is definitely some work, but it's a different kind of work that will produce results that, geez, at a minimum, alleviate some stress and bring some wellness into your life.
Mm-hmm. What I really love here, Roseann, is you bring that common sense and that sort of long-term view, not only how to heal and reverse symptoms of certain conditions, but also how to bring the family together. That's what I'm getting. You are using spiritual modalities as well, and I love it. We are all here for spirituality, and the breathing, the meditating. That's all should be a daily practice for
daily practice. And I think spirituality is missing in my field of mental health, and I don't think people talk about it enough. And you know, I personally, even for myself, 2020 was like an incredibly busy year for me. And you know, what did I want for 2021 is actually to get a little more rebalanced and be more connected on the spiritual side, right? Because when you're grounded, and for me, that comes through connecting with a higher source, then you are much better able to handle things no matter what comes across your way. And when we can teach that to our kids, they have greater self-awareness, and they have greater self-confidence, and ultimately those things lead to greater happiness. And we want that for our kids. I think that's so important. You know,
that we definitely want for our children. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And well, the only thing which springs to mind is, I know when we are working with smaller, younger children, maybe those techniques are not going to be the easiest one to implement, e.g. meditation and breathing work. But I'm sure you've got some tips in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, you know, my kids are my kids, but lots of people I work with, you just start these things early, right? Your kids are 1, just start the conversations. Like, you know, I always did yoga. My kids always came up to me and tried to do yoga moves when I was doing yoga, and I embraced it. And I was like, go ahead. And just teaching them through those ways. We often think it's a big thing that we have to do. What I want to say is mental health and role modeling mental health comes through many little moments. And we're not perfect, and we should never think we're perfect. And even when we're not perfect, we should use it as an opportunity to talk about that with our kids and say, well, you know, gosh, I freaked out on that. I could have did this differently, right? You know, my little guy, I said to him, you know, mommy's really sad because of what happened with a friend. And I told him, and I was like, you know, mommy's gonna be sad. She's gonna, you know, go to bed early the next few weeks or whatever. I let him know. And I was like, you've got to, you know, is an opportunity for him to understand, to better for himself. So I think when we talk about little kids can do meditation. They can do breath work, but it might be for a few seconds, right?
Yes, just to plant the seeds for the future.
Plant the seeds, and then it becomes so much easier when you're like, "Hey, we're taking a meditation class." You know what I mean? You know. So, you know, I think that, and meditation also too. There's these great free apps, Insight Timer, Headspace, or whatever. You know, you can set it down when you're putting your kid to bed and be like, "Let's try this for a few minutes." And they're so easy, and it just teaches them, and you know, just like they learn how to brush their teeth or anything like that, it takes time.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. we can't escape that 2020 heritage we've got. So for some people, it was a year of anxiety and stress. I think for most of us, I would say. Do you think we will have a long-term impact of that pandemic, post-pandemic impact on our children? What do you think?
I think there's no way to escape a long-term impact. Okay. What does that mean? And what does that look like for each kid? I'm going to tell you is highly dependent on the mental health of the family. And
back to the family.
And the truth is, I mean, research says this all the time, and not that I want to peg us on us mom, but the number one determinant of a child's mental health is their mother. So here's what I want to say to people. When you got your stuff together, your kid's going to have their stuff together. It's just that way. So does that mean you have to pretend you're not hurting? Absolutely not. But what it means is that, again, we have to role model how we manage stress, how we cope. It doesn't mean we ignore it. It means that we process it. We talk to our kids about it. We show them it. Ideally, we include them in certain things. And so what's the long-term impact? You know, I mean, I've been supporting kids and their families in this past year, and some kids are doing great. I'd say the majority of kids are okay. They really are. When I see a highly stressed out, freaked out parent, I see a kid who's suffering. That doesn't mean, I'd say the biggest group of kids that I see really affected are teens and college kids who are isolated. And when the greater the isolation, the greater the feelings of sadness and depression. And so
the connection is so important.
So connected.
Yes, that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, emotional regulation for young children does absolutely start with connection. And then it becomes modeling and looking at the people in their family and how they manage stress, right? So if we have somebody, you know, like who is you're role modeling how to manage stress, because we always have stress, right? So I think this year has taught us about, holy moly, the things keep hitting us. What's in your toolkit? And so that has to be the message that's sent to families today, is like, build your toolkit in 2021, because if you didn't get it started in 2020, we already know 2021 still feels chaotic. It still feels like a spiritual energy crisis in 2021.
Yes, and talking of toolkits, you have built your own toolkits, which you are sharing with others. Teletherapy, it's your newest method. If you could just tell us quickly about it.
Sure. So I have a book. It's called Teletherapy Toolkit, and it's the first book ever written on teletherapy activities for therapists to use with kids when they're working virtually. I do have a lot of parents buying this book because it's filled with visual, ready to use. A lot of things are kinesthetic activities, like, for example, a stress meter and a visual stress meter, and then teaching you how to use it with your kids. So I've had a lot of nice feedback from parents. But you know, therapists were literally not trained on how to do teletherapy, and I had been doing teletherapy for a long time, and I put together this 420-page book and wrote it in 31 days because I was like, I needed to get it out. I wanted people to have it. You know what the number one year's resolution was in 2021?
Oh, I'm not sure.
You want to take a guess?
No.
To go to therapy is the number one resolution for people.
Oh, wow. That's how badly we've been affected.
That's how badly we've been affected. So now 80% of resolutions are not met. So I think people need to, you know, therapy is about learning. It's not about going in and complaining about your mother. So a good therapist teaches you new ways to take action. And so I would encourage people, especially with special needs kids, like find an awesome therapist and teach your kids. Invest in teaching early, especially kids on the autistic spectrum. Kids with learning and behavioral issues, it takes 34 times to learn something at an automatic, intuitive level, where you don't think about it, like driving a stick shift. But for a special needs child, it's a minimum of 3 times that amount. And so making an investment, when I've gotten to work with people that are now adults, right? I have people that bring their kids to me now, and I love it. And when it comes to autism, there's so many things that I get to see work. And I'm going to tell you, really making an investment with quality social skills and teaching them self-regulation and consistently is such a huge positive investment. Really, really, truly. They have different life outcomes when people make that. You got to get a good therapist. So yes, you can get my book on Amazon. It's on Amazon.
Beautiful. We'll put a link to Amazon in the comment section, because I absolutely love the idea of parents getting the book and being working on that connection with children and doing the therapy themselves. Presumably the exercises are easy enough to use by non-trained people. Which is great. And that simplicity of your message is really beautiful. I love the fact that we're looking at family as a unit, spreading the love and awareness around and out, I guess, because we are living in a social unit anyway, so it all wraps out of in our interactions. Not that we have many these days.
But I know we got to find different ways to interact. I know Zoom is not a great thing. I do have for anybody that's interested, I have a bonus. It's called it's my coping statement. So I have over 100 coping statements for parents to use with kids to help them cope with stress. So remember, those little moments create big waves. So if we can direct how we're talking to them and we tweak it, like just little tweaks, it just creates like this positive chain. So you can go to teletherapytoolkitbonus.com, and free download for my 100 statements. So
we put that in the comment section as well.
Please do. I use them all the time.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sure our viewers did, and we had amazing comments here. And this will be available on replay for the future. And I hope we'll see you here again.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a great. I love the concept of this group, and we need to support each other more with less judgment, for sure.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Roseann, and everyone who watched. Bye for now.